The surface of Narragansett Bay still gleamed with a coppery hue as John and Evelyn Marston vanished from the coastal town of South Kingstown, Rhode Island, population over 10,000. The August evening descended with a thick layer of salty mist wrapping around the jagged hazard rocks. At 7:40 p.m., a bartender at a tavern near Bonnet Shores waved goodbye through the back door after seeing the couple leave, Evelyn still holding the thin silk scarf she had carried throughout the trip. They crossed the narrow path leading out to the rocky shore, where the waves crashing against the cliffs produced the deep, familiar roar of the New England Sea. An elderly woman living in the house above the headland saw a black sedan driving slowly in that direction, its headlights the last streak of light before being swallowed by the darkness. What happened in the nearly 1 hour that followed would haunt Rhode Island for the next 3 decades. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. In the summer of 1967, the air in Boston was filled with the busy rhythm of industrial life, while the Narragansett Bay area and Rhode Island began entering the tourist season with its windswept coastal roads and streams of cars arriving from all over New England. Against this backdrop, John Marston, 36, a senior executive at a major Boston record label, and his wife Evelyn Marston, 34, a reserved woman who always appeared alongside her husband at social events, prepared for a short weekend trip to Narragansett. As agreed with both families, they left Boston around 6:10 p.m., traveling in their 1966 Plymouth Fury along Route 1A, expecting to arrive in Narragansett before dark. Records show they stopped for gas at a station near Wickford at 7:05 p.m., then continued toward the coast. A witness at Bonnet Shores reported seeing 2 people matching the description of John and Evelyn around 7:40 p.m., standing near the path down to the beach. Around 8:05 p.m., a couple walking along the rocky shore at Hazard Rocks said they saw 2 figures that looked very much like the Marstons, standing close to the edge, facing the sea. After that point, there were no further sightings or records of their presence. The next morning, when the family tried calling multiple times without response, concern began to mount. John had a habit of calling home in the morning whenever he was away, and Evelyn always stayed in touch with her sister. But that day, the phone rang unanswered in silence. When their car failed to return to Boston as planned, and no one in the family knew their whereabouts, suspicion that something had gone wrong became unmistakable. At 11:28 a.m., after repeated unsuccessful attempts to reach them, the family decided to report the matter to the Boston Police Department, officially marking the moment the Marstons were recorded as missing. As soon as the Marston family's missing persons report reached the Boston Police Department, the duty desk immediately began the initial verification process, gathering all the information provided by the family and cross-referencing it with city administrative records. The desk officer entered a full description of John and Evelyn Marston into the log, including ages, occupations, identifying features, and the light blue Plymouth Fury they were using for the trip. A quick check confirmed that the couple had no other plans beyond the previously reported Narragansett trip, further reinforcing the unusual nature of the prolonged lack of contact. After compiling the initial facts, Boston PD determined that the last known location where the Marstons were seen fell outside their jurisdiction. Under missing persons procedures of the 1960s, the case had to be transferred to the agency with authority at the location of the disappearance, so the file was promptly forwarded to the South Kingstown Police Department, the unit responsible for the Narragansett area and surrounding coastline. South Kingstown Police received the report via interagency communication and requested a detailed summary of the travel itinerary, the time contact was lost, and witness information provided by the family. Since no national database or modern missing persons management tools existed, all information was manually recorded into a missing persons case file using the administrative forms of the 1960s. The investigating officer who created the file clearly categorized details about the departure time from Boston, the gas stop, and the sighting timeline at Bonnet Shores, while also noting the extended lack of contact from morning until the report was filed. Reconstructing the Marstons' travel route was done using AAA paper maps, estimated travel times for each segment, and cross-checking with witness accounts collected by Boston PD. Through this, investigators narrowed down the final stretch the 2 victims most likely traveled before disappearing, focusing on the coastal area between Bonnet Shores and Hazard Rocks. Recognizing that the disappearance had stretched over many hours with no signs of voluntary departure or recontact, and with their vehicle still unlocated, South Kingstown Police leadership assessed the case as suspicious and requiring urgent handling. The decision was made by midday, launch an initial search operation, mobilize road patrol teams to sweep the coastal route, deploy foot search groups in rocky terrain areas, and place the Coast Guard on standby for support if needed. The nature of the case shifted from loss of contact to missing under unknown circumstances, officially initiating the first step in the effort to locate the Marstons across the entire Narragansett area. Immediately after South Kingstown police decided to launch the initial search operation, the participating forces were organized into a mixed team, including local police, support personnel from Narragansett Police, a small Coast Guard unit based at Point Judith, and volunteers living around the Bonnet Shores area. Multi-agency coordination was necessary because the Narragansett coastal terrain combined wide sandy beaches, sharp rocky zones, low vegetation, and narrow trails leading to small headlands, creating numerous blind spots in hard-to-access areas. First, the operation commander established a composite map by marking the last-seen locations of the victims, including the Bonnet Shores beach area and the rocky shore at Hazard Rocks. To ensure nothing was overlooked, the Black Point area was also included in the analysis due to its terrain prone to slips or hidden traces. Once the search perimeter was defined, the ground search teams began implementing a grid search pattern, dividing the area into small cells running along a north-south axis. Each group of 3 to 4 people moved in a line abreast, maintaining even spacing to observe the ground, small paths, rock crevices, and any signs potentially related to the Marstons' disappearance. Teams rotated shifts continuously to maintain focus, while recording all points of interest for the team leader to compile. Meanwhile, the Coast Guard's Marine Patrol deployed 2 motorboats running parallel to the shoreline, concentrating on areas with strong currents or near rock crevices where objects could be carried away or lodged. Sea searches at that time relied almost entirely on visual observation, as modern sonar equipment was unavailable. Patrol boats moved slowly, sweeping in multiple parallel lines from a few meters to over 30 meters from shore. The water that day was fairly clear, but large waves made underwater observation difficult, forcing officers to increase the number of passes over the same areas. At the same time, a small Coast Guard helicopter was mobilized for aerial observation. The helicopter flew in wide arcs around Bonnet Shores, then proceeded toward Hazard Rocks and farther out to Black Point. From above, the crew could detect changes in surface color, new paths on the sand, or shifts in large boulders that might indicate contact or impact. Photographs taken with an externally mounted camera were sent down to the ground team after each pass for rapid analysis by the coordination unit. After nearly 3 hours of continuous searching, several anomalous locations began to be flagged for closer inspection. At the southern edge of Bonnet Shores, the ground team discovered an area of disturbed sand, unlike ordinary footprints, with the surface stretched in a direction against the wind, suggesting something or someone may have been dragged. Not far away, near the edge of Hazard Rocks, another group noted dark streaks on a flat rock slab, judged not to be from natural seaweed or soil. At the same time, the patrol boat reported a floating object about 20 meters offshore, though closer inspection revealed it to be only a piece of driftwood carried in by the waves. The helicopter also reported an area of unusually colored rocks along the eastern stretch of Black Point, prompting the coordination team to add it to the list for supplemental afternoon surveys. Although no direct traces clearly linked to John or Evelyn had been found, the rate at which anomalous locations appeared indicated that the area requiring detailed inspection was gradually narrowing. This prompted the operation commander to adjust the search plan, ordering teams to revisit the flagged points, use smaller observation ranges, and record in detail every ground structure, scratch, slip mark, or foreign object that could help determine what happened on the last night the Marstons were seen in Narragansett. After the search teams returned to the anomalous locations flagged in the morning, South Kingstown police began implementing a more detailed survey phase, focusing on the southern edge of Bonnet Shores and the Hazard Rock Strip, where scattered traces suggested possible contact or unusual movement on the night the Marstons disappeared. The ground investigation team was assigned to examine the disturbed sand area near the beach access path, removing the surface layer of sand to clarify the underlying trace structures. There they discovered a faint but discernible drag mark line running from the edge of the sand toward the rocky area, estimated at over 4 meters long. Nearby were small, unevenly deep indentations interpreted as possible heel marks or slips from someone trying to maintain balance on sinking sand. When shifting to survey the lower rock area adjacent to Hazard Rocks, the second group found a small grayish-white object lodged between 2 rock slabs. After collection and cleaning with a specialized cloth, They identified it as a handkerchief embroidered with the initials EM, matching Evelyn Marston's name in the missing persons file. A few steps away, another object caught the light and drew the investigators' attention. A broken metal eyeglass frame, scratched and deformed at the bridge, deemed unlikely to have been damaged solely by normal weather exposure. Expanding upward to the higher sections of Hazard Rocks, another group discovered a torn piece of light blue fabric, snagged on a sharp rock edge. The size and material matched the type of light shirt John Marston was described as wearing that evening, per information provided by the family to Boston police. These finds were tagged with numbered markers, photographed on site with a Kodak film camera, and placed in evidence bags according to local police standards of the time. In addition to the clear evidence items, the scene survey team recorded further surface marks on the rocks, long skid marks running from the higher rock edge down toward the water, their color and direction indicating the surface had been subjected to a heavy object sliding across it. A single shoe print was also found on a patch of dry seaweed north of the rocky area, approximately size 11, not matching the shoe size the family reported for John. Investigators measured the print with a wooden ruler, recorded it in the log, and sketched it using standard 1967 forensic techniques. All these elements were compiled to form an initial picture suggesting a possible struggle or forceful movement in the area. However, the collected evidence and surface traces were not yet sufficient to confirm the nature of the incident, as many signs could have been influenced by natural conditions, especially in seaside areas with strong winds and slippery rock surfaces. Upon bringing the evidence back to South Kingstown Police Headquarters for examination, the forensic investigator followed 1960s technical standards. The handkerchief was checked for blood or foreign substances, but initial results showed no clear indications. The broken glasses were analyzed for deformation to determine impact force, though the conclusion was that the break could have multiple causes, insufficient to indicate violent action. The light blue fabric fragment was compared in material and stitching to descriptions of John's clothing, but without direct comparison samples, positive confirmation remained pending. The rock skid marks were sketched in the report, but lacking advanced friction measurement or abrasion analysis tools, the mechanism of formation remained speculative. The preliminary report compiled from the survey teams was sent back to the operation commander, stating that the evidence found was consistent with John and Evelyn's presence in the area, but the connection between the items and any criminal or violent behavior was not yet strong enough to classify the case as such. At this stage, what had been established was only the unusual positioning of objects and the presence of unexplained traces, reinforcing the assumption that Hazard Rocks was the last place the Marstons were present before disappearing, but still lacking sufficient grounds to determine what had happened to them. The initial evidence recovered at Hazard Rocks forced South Kingstown Police to shift focus to gathering social witness statements from individuals present around Narragansett on the evening Marstons disappeared, to determine whether the anomalous traces aligned with the activities of any other individuals. The first investigation team was sent to a small tavern near Bonnet Shores, a place with steady evening traffic from tourists and locals. The owner, who had worked there for years, recalled that he had seen a couple matching the description of John and Evelyn appear outside the tavern that evening, looking at the men aboard but not entering. A female server confirmed this and added that she had noticed a strange middle-aged man in a dark coat approach Evelyn, exchanging a few words with her before the couple left the area. According to her description, the man's demeanor seemed tense, while Evelyn appeared uncomfortable with the approach. The investigation team immediately recorded all these details in the file and asked the server to describe the man's appearance in as much detail as possible for later comparison. After the tavern, the team moved to the rocky shore area, where some local residents frequently walked in the evenings. An elderly couple reported seeing a black sedan parked in a rather odd spot, close to an area that was not a public parking lot. They remembered the vehicle, because its headlights came on for a few seconds, then went out completely just as they walked past, as if someone inside was watching or waiting for something. Although they did not recall the license plate, they insisted the color and style did not match any cars they typically saw from local residents. At a house near the beach access path, a family picnicking that night reported hearing unusual sounds from the shoreline around after 8 p.m. According to them, it was not the sound of waves or animals, but rather a brief argument-like noise, followed by a loud impact, like something heavy striking rock. Busy packing up their gear, They did not go to check and saw nothing in the darkness, but the timing matched other witnesses' accounts. These statements were compiled by the investigation team into a timeline analysis table to cross-reference with the crime scene evidence times and family provided information. When sequencing the events, police noted that the period from 7:40 p.m. to 8:15 p.m. contained multiple significant overlaps between the victim's presence, the appearance of the strange man at the tavern, and the black sedan spotted near Hazard Rocks. From these fragmented but directional descriptions, South Kingstown police began compiling a preliminary suspect list. The man who approached Evelyn at the tavern became the first subject requiring identity verification. The team then checked owners of black sedans in the Narragansett area in 1956 to identify individuals who might have been near the rocky shore at the time of the disappearance. A small boat owner nearby was added to the list because Hay was in the area, but claimed to have seen nothing, though his statement was deemed inconsistent and required rechecking. A restaurant employee nearby was also listed due to a coincidental shift in time aligning with the victim's last sighting, though no clear evidence linked him. The initial list, thus, included 4 individuals: the strange man who approached Evelyn, the owner of the black sedan, the nearby boat owner, and the restaurant employee with a suspicious schedule. Police created separate files for each subject, including physical descriptions, possible locations during the event, and assessed relevance based on witness statements. These facts were not yet conclusive, but they provided a crucial foundation for investigators to determine the next directions for follow-up questioning in the effort to reconstruct the final events before the Marstons disappeared from Narragansett that night. After the preliminary list of 4 suspects was compiled based on witness statements, South Kingstown police proceeded with the screening step by verifying alibis for each individual, starting with the subject believed to have been present in the Rocky Shore area on the night of the incident. The first was the restaurant employee who finished his shift around 8:00 p.m. Records showed he lived in a boarding house about 2 miles from Bonnet Shores and had a habit of walking home via a route through the eastern residential area. Investigators checked the time clock and received confirmation from the restaurant manager that this person left work later than usual due to an extended shift, with the timing matching the initial statement. Further verification from a regular customer at the restaurant stated they saw him cleaning the counter around the time the victims were sighted at Hazard Rocks, leading to his elimination from the list due to a sufficiently clear alibi. The second suspect was the small boat owner who usually moored near the rocky area. He claimed that on that evening he was at a friend's house in northern Narragansett repairing a boat engine. Investigators directly verified this information with the friend he mentioned and checked fresh oil change marks on the engine that matched the statement. Both accounts aligned on time and location with no internal contradictions, allowing police to eliminate this suspect from the list. With the 2 initial suspects cleared, the focus of the investigation shifted to the remaining 2. The strange man described as approaching Evelyn at the tavern and the owner of the black sedan parked near Hazard Rocks that evening. Although neither had been fully identified, their behavioral indicators and presence at key locations led investigators to assess their relevance as higher than the 2 already excluded. For the man who approached Evelyn, investigators returned to the tavern and requested a more detailed description from the staff, including height, hairstyle, gait, and clothing. These descriptions were sketched into a preliminary composite based on hand-drawn identification techniques guided by 1960s police standards. Analysis of the statements showed that this man not only appeared at the right time, but also directly approached the victim under circumstances indicating tension, making him a high-priority subject. In addition, the investigation team sought additional witnesses around the tavern and obtained supplementary information that this man left the area in the direction of Hazard Rocks, matching the timeline when unusual noises were reported from the shoreline. This reinforced the assessment that he was present at successive key locations within a short time frame. For the remaining suspect, the owner of the black sedan, verification proved more complicated due to no license plate being recorded. Investigators had to review the 1967 vehicle registration lists for Narragansett and South Kingstown, narrowing down owners of matching black sedans. Several vehicles were immediately excluded because their owners were not in the area, or the cars were documented as being elsewhere that evening. However, 2 owners could not immediately verify their whereabouts at the time of the disappearance. and one of them matched the description of the vehicle style seen by witnesses. Since it could not yet be determined who was present at the rocky shore that night, investigators placed both in the priority verification category. Cross-referencing witness statements with vehicle operation timelines helped narrow the remaining list, while also revealing a minor inconsistency in one sedan owner's statement, as he could not account for a prolonged gap in his activities that evening. When sequencing the events, the two remaining suspects, the strange man who approached Evelyn and the black sedan owner with an inconsistent statement, demonstrated significant relevance because they appeared at key locations. During the time frame matching the Marstons' disappearance, investigators prioritized them based on three 1960s criteria: level of contact with the victims, degree of location-time overlap, and level of abnormality in statements. Accordingly, the strange man who approached Evelyn was ranked highest priority due to direct interaction with the victim just before they vanished. The suspect linked to the black sedan was ranked second because of the vehicle's presence in a sparsely trafficked area, combined with an unstable statement. These two suspects became the focus of the next investigative phase, with the goal of clearly establishing their identities, movements, and level of involvement in the disappearance of the Marston couple in Narragansett that night. After narrowing the remaining suspect list to two individuals with high relevance, South Kingstown police recognized the need to revisit and reassess the entire route the Marstons may have traveled before appearing in the Hazard Rocks area, in order to clarify whether any point of approach or confrontation occurred outside the initially searched perimeter. The terrain investigation team re-examined secondary routes connecting from Route 1A into Bonnet Shores, including narrow lanes passing through sparsely populated residential areas and dirt paths typically used only by locals. These routes were checked in the direction from the gas stop in Wickford to the beach area, aiming to identify any sufficiently secluded location that could have served as a point of contact with the victims before they reached Hazard Rocks. The survey team noted that most secondary routes were wide enough for compact cars, but dim evening lighting combined with uneven terrain made them unlikely spots for prolonged stops. Some roadside areas showed old tire marks, but there was no way to determine when they were formed, so they were not considered valuable evidence. As the search expanded to the boundary area between Bonnet Shores and the coastal grassland, the team looked for signs of unusual movement, but found only footprints mixed with animal tracks, none clear enough to link to John and Evelyn's disappearance. The focus of the review then returned to the Hazard Rocks and Black Point areas, where the terrain was more complex and prone to slips or wave impacts. The scene team used topographic maps to assess surface changes, compared to previous descriptions, and closely examined rock crevices that could retain traces or small objects for hours. However, all scratches or light streaks on the rocks showed signs of erosion from sea wind and large waves, making origin determination unfeasible. To strengthen the assessment of possible conflict near the water's edge, the investigation team enlisted a Coast Guard employee to analyze natural factors on the night of August 17, 1967. Weather records for the day showed moderate southeast winds and above-average wave heights due to atmospheric pressure changes. This could explain the deformation of some skid marks on the rocks and reduce the likelihood of retaining evidence on surfaces near the waterline. Tide data also indicated that water levels rose around 2 p.m. that evening, coinciding with the time witnesses heard unusual noises, leading the team to speculate that if any object had fallen into the water, initial traces could have been erased. Additionally, the Black Point area at night was typically dark and sparsely trafficked, but the elevation differences between rock layers made it difficult to select as an approach point if the perpetrator wished to avoid being seen. Unless they had deep familiarity with the terrain, investigators walked the entire path connecting Bonnet Shores to Black Point, marking locations where vehicles could stop or pedestrians could move at night. The results showed no other area besides Hazard Rocks combined sufficient seclusion, easy access, and the ability to produce traces matching the collected evidence. Additional sweeps along the coastal road yielded no new signs. All tire tracks or disturbed soil were of undetermined age and could not be specifically linked to the events of that evening. When cross-referencing all data collected from evidence, statements, and terrain evaluation, the investigation team concluded that no location outside the already surveyed areas had a direct connection to the Marstons' disappearance. Secondary routes were eliminated from focus due to the absence of new evidence or additional statements supporting possible contact at those locations. All existing data pointed back to the central axis, Bonnet Shores, Hazard Rocks, and the rocky strip near Black Point. Despite extensive efforts to expand the analysis scope, investigators had to acknowledge that no additional physical evidence was recorded during the review. The lack of new evidence meant no further investigative avenues could be opened based on scene data. All information gathered up to this point only reinforced the assumption that if an unusual event occurred, it almost certainly took place within the narrow area around Hazard Rocks, which aligned with both witness statements and evidence recorded in the initial search days. Although search teams had combed the entire coastal area, collected witness statements, screened suspects, and re-evaluated the travel route, South Kingstown police still could not uncover any new evidence or traces to clarify what happened to the Marston couple. When all initial investigative approaches had been exhausted without yielding specific results, the limitations of 1967 investigative work gradually became apparent. First, the absence of bodies prevented the force from determining the legal nature of the case. No evidence of injury, no conclusion on cause of death, and no confirmation whether this was an accident, voluntary disappearance, or criminal act. Without this legal anchor, all arguments remain speculative and insufficient to open a criminal file. Next, the technical limitations of forensics at the time prevented deeper analysis of much of the collected evidence. The torn fabric, handkerchief, and damaged eyeglass frame contained no microscopic traces that could match a suspect, as DNA testing, advanced fiber analysis, or biological sampling did not exist. The skid marks on rocks, drag marks, and shoe prints were heavily affected by sea wind and tidal action, making precise measurement or comparison to any individual shoe size impossible. This left all evidence in the realm of scene description rather than indicators of culpability. Within the investigation, the files on the two high-relevance suspects could not progress further. The man who approached Evelyn at the tavern had no complete identifying information beyond a crude sketch. With no surveillance cameras or photo storage systems, police had to rely on witness memory, which was highly limited and prone to distortion over time. Efforts to locate this individual were conducted within Narragansett and surrounding areas, but no one fully matched the description. For the black sedan owner near Hazard Rocks, vehicle verification based on registration records also yielded no results. No license plate was recorded. No witness identified the driver, and all owners deemed unaccounted for provided reasonable explanations when investigated further. Combining these factors, investigators had to concede that no investigative direction had sufficient evidence to expand further. All they had were matching timelines, scattered evidence, and the presence of two potential suspects without any direct connecting proof of wrongdoing. The final investigative summary report highlighted three major deficiencies of 1967: inability to recover bodies or determine the victim's final location, lack of sufficiently advanced forensic tools to analyze evidence, and insufficient legal grounds to classify the case as a crime. In the context of the limited law enforcement and technical capabilities of the 1960s, the Marston couple's case file was reclassified as missing under undetermined circumstances and transferred to long-term storage in the South Kingstown Police Archives. After weeks of investigation with no progress, authorities officially closed the case and moved it to cold case status, concluding the initial investigative phase without any definitive conclusion regarding the fate of John and Evelyn Marston. 34 years after the Marston couple's missing persons file was relegated to cold case status, the Rhode Island coast was hit by Hurricane Nora, a rare powerful storm that made landfall in late September, bringing heavy rain, gusty winds, and widespread landslides along the rocky shoreline from Bonnet Shores to Black Point. After the storm cleared, Rhode Island Department of Parks personnel were assigned to assess damage at Black Point, an area known for its tiered rock formations and frequent landslides during prolonged heavy rain. While inspecting the coastal trail, one employee discovered a freshly slid layer of earth and rock, exposing an unusual depression between two large boulders. Approaching closer, he noticed whitish-gray structures mixed in the mud within the upturned soil initially thought to be coral fragments or animal bones, but the curved shape and thickness did not match. Suspecting human bone, he immediately marked the area and notified South Kingstown police. Investigators arrived on scene that same afternoon and quickly determined that the exposed bone fragments were not animal but human, showing long-term decomposition. The scene was secured, and a forensic team was summoned to conduct a controlled excavation. Because the area was right at the rock edge, excavation proceeded manually with small tools to avoid damaging any remaining traces. After several hours of removing soil and rock layers and careful sifting, the forensic team uncovered a set of skeletal remains in a curled position, heavily decomposed but still sufficiently intact to identify as an adult human structure. Not long afterward, while expanding the dig 1 meter eastward, they discovered a second set of skeletal remains at a similar depth, buried in a layer of soil, thick enough to conceal but not stable enough to withstand the severe landslide triggered by the storm. The discovery of 2 sets of remains in the same location immediately led investigators to connect it to the 1967 missing persons case, especially since Black Point had been within the initial search zone, but yielded no significant finds at the time. Even more notably, while sifting the soil around the second set of remains, the excavation team found a small rotted fabric pouch that still retained its shape, lodged beneath a boulder. Inside the pouch was a small reel-to-reel audio tape, its surface covered in dust and mold from age. The tape was placed in a separate container for preservation, as investigators recognized it could contain critical information if recoverable. The bone fragments were collected according to forensic protocol and transported to the lab for age, sex, and possible linkage to old missing persons files. Upon completing the excavation, South Kingstown police prepared an on-scene report detailing the location, condition of the bones, burial depth, and surrounding geological context. The discovery of 2 sets of remains in an area that had been the focal point of the 1967 search led authorities to assess this as likely an intentional burial site rather than a random consequence of the landslide. The presence of the fabric pouch containing the tape further supported the possibility of human intervention in the matter. When initial information reached headquarters, South Kingstown police leadership reviewed the Marston missing persons file, cross-referencing it with the discovery location and recovered evidence. The match in geographic context, disappearance timeline, and the simultaneous recovery of 2 sets of remains prompted re-evaluation of the case as likely connected to the previously unresolved disappearance. Because the recovery of bodies was a decisive factor in crime classification under 2000's regulations, South Kingstown police immediately reclassified the file from missing under unknown circumstances to suspected homicide with unidentified perpetrator, and officially reopened the case as a homicide investigation. This decision marked a major turning point, ending 34 years of archive status and opening a new investigative phase based on the concrete physical evidence uncovered after Hurricane Nora. After the 2 sets of skeletal remains and the fabric pouch containing the reel-to-reel tape were recovered from the landslide area at Black Point, South Kingstown police transferred all evidence to the Rhode Island State Crime Laboratory's Forensic Examination Division for analysis under modern protocols. The forensic team's first task was to identify the 2 sets of remains through DNA testing, a technology non-existent when the Marstons' disappearance was investigated in 1967. Bone samples were cleaned, chemically processed, and DNA extracted from preserved marrow structures, sufficient for analysis. Due to more than 3 decades of decomposition, the remaining DNA quantity was low, requiring technicians to use STR amplification methods to increase sensitivity and enable comparison with reference samples collected from living Marston family relatives. After multiple amplification rounds and quality checks, results showed both sets of remains shared blood relation to the same family, with the larger skull set consisted with male sex and the other with female. When compared to DNA reference samples from John and Evelyn's relatives, both matches reached high confidence levels, allowing the forensic lab to conclude that the male remains belonged to John Marston and the female remains to Evelyn Marston. After identification, the forensic team proceeded to analyze injuries on the bones to determine the mechanism of death. With soft tissue completely decomposed, cause of death had to be inferred from remaining mechanical signs on bone structure. Examination of John's skull revealed a long fracture running from the temporal region to the crown, with sharp fracture surfaces and no signs of bone remodeling, indicating perimortem trauma inflicted immediately before death. The fracture pattern was consistent with a heavy impact from a hard object, most likely one with an edge or sharp angle. Additionally, several ribs showed compression-type fractures, indicating impact from the front or side, possibly during a struggle or being forcefully pushed against a hard surface. The arm and wrist bones displayed small defensive fractures, commonly seen when a victim raises their arms to shield themselves before an attack. For Evelyn's remains, forensics noted a longitudinal crack at the back of the skull with clean fracture surfaces, indicating a strong, direct blow. Several chest and clavicle bones showed heavy impact signs consistent with falling from height or being shoved hard onto a rigid surface. Notably, the left hip bone exhibited a characteristic longitudinal crack from pulling or twisting trauma, suggesting the victim may have been moved after the initial attack. No penetrating stab or cut marks were found on the remaining bones, indicating the injury-causing instrument was most likely a blunt object or the rocky surface of the hazard rocks area. Combining both sets of remains, the forensic team concluded that both John and Evelyn died from severe head and chest trauma, consistent with intentional direct assault or forceful impact. After injury analysis, forensics moved to estimate time of death using biological, entomological, and soil sediment analysis methods. Soil samples from the layers surrounding the remains were examined for organic decomposition levels, mineral composition, and tidal leaching extent. Based on sediment layering ratios and bone stability, scientists determined the remains had lain buried for at least 30 years. Comparing residual insect evidence in cocoon shells and decomposed remains with regional climate records, entomological analysis showed the presence of a beetle species characteristic of late 1960s conditions, reinforcing the assumption that the time of death aligned with 1967. Finally, integrating injury assessment, soil analysis, and DNA data, the forensic lab issued its official conclusion. Both victims died within a time frame very close to the date they were reported missing, and the mechanism of death matched trauma from intentional impact, not natural accident. The forensic report was returned to South Kingstown Police, stating clearly that the two sets of remains found at Black Point were those of John and Evelyn Marston, missing since 1967, and that their injuries exhibited characteristics of violent conduct. The report concluded this was a homicide that occurred in 1967, concealed to avoid detection, and only exposed after the landslide caused by Hurricane Nora. The clear identification of the victims and the mechanism of death transformed a disappearance case spanning more than 3 decades into a murder investigation requiring full re-examination with complete legal authority and criminal scope. After the forensic report confirmed that the two sets of skeletal remains at Black Point were those of John and Evelyn Marston and concluded that this was a homicide that occurred in 1967, South Kingstown Police were compelled to conduct a comprehensive review of the old case file to reconstruct the investigation that had been stalled for more than 3 decades. The first task of the new investigation team was to assemble all remaining physical evidence, logs, and notes from 1967 that were still stored in paper form in the police department's old archives. The surviving evidence included the handkerchief, eyeglass frame, fabric fragment, hand-drawn sketches of trace locations at hazard rocks, and witness statement reports typed on typewriters. All of it was collected, categorized, and transferred to the state's Digital Analysis Lab for digitization according to modern standards. The fabric and metal evidence items were photographed under broad spectrum and oblique lighting to recreate surface structure details, allowing for morphological analysis and damage assessment that had previously been impossible. The hand-drawn scene sketches were scanned at high resolution and rescaled to serve as base data for spatial analysis. All witness statements were re-entered as digital text to facilitate cross-referencing for matching points across information sources. Once digitization was complete, the investigation team began examining the errors that had led to the dead-end conclusion in the 1967 file. One of the most fundamental weaknesses of the original investigation was the lack of quantitative data and graphical simulations, which caused scene-event evaluations to rely heavily on the subjective observations of officers at the time. There were also no properly timed crime scene photographs, as the initial search team primarily focused on area sweeps, resulting in many important traces potentially being overlooked or incompletely documented. The absence of specialized evidence analysis tools, such as DNA testing, microfiber analysis, or vehicle database tracing meant that facts once considered unimportant now became noteworthy with the support of modern technology. Another flaw was the heavy reliance on witness statements without cross-verification using spatial temporal data. Old records showed that the last sighting of the Marstons, the time witnesses heard unusual noises, and the appearance of the black sedan were not linked into a detailed system. This left the investigation without the ability to reconstruct the full sequence of events in a verifiable timeline. After transferring all old data into the digital analysis system, the investigation team used 3-dimensional crime scene reconstruction software, inputting time markers, witness locations, and evidence positions to rebuild a movement map of the Bonnet Shores Hazard Rocks Black Point area on the evening of August 17, 1967. The reconstruction revealed that the sequence of events occurred over a much shorter period than initially assessed. From the moment the Marstons left the tavern area until the unusual noises were heard at Hazard Rocks, lasted only about 30 minutes, enough time for an approach and attack to occur if someone had been following them beforehand. When the locations of evidence items such as the handkerchief, eyeglass frame, and fabric fragment were integrated into the spatial model, the investigation team observed that the distribution trajectory of the evidence aligned with a brief struggle before the victims were moved toward the lower rock area and then farther to Black Point, where the two sets of remains were later discovered. These analyses highlighted the two suspects previously noted in the 1967 file: the man who approached Evelyn at the tavern and the owner of the black sedan seen near Hazarded Rocks. However, when cross-referencing all new data, particularly movement capabilities, appearance times, and approach directions, the investigation team found that the described behavior and timing of the man at the tavern fit an individual with direct and continuous opportunity to shadow the victims. When re-examining residency and activity records of individuals living in Narragansett in 1967, only one person matched the fragmented descriptions and witness statements: Victor Delero, a music production industry employee who was present in the area at the time of the incident and had been indirectly linked to the Marstons' travel schedule through a prior professional connection. The overlaps in timing, location, and physical description made it highly likely that the identity of the strange man at the tavern matched Delero. Digital timeline reconstruction also showed that the black sedan's possible route could align with this individual's approach if he was moving between points along the rocky shore. When synthesizing all data from the old file and the new analyses, Victor Delero emerged as the first viable suspect on the list, with the highest level of consistency across behavior, timing, and context related to the disappearance of John and Evelyn Marston on that night in 1967. After the identities of the two sets of remains were confirmed, and Victor Delero emerged as the first viable suspect through digitized timeline reconstruction, South Kingstown police shifted to analyzing the reel-to-reel tape recovered from the fabric pouch buried with the remains of Black Point, viewing it as one of the key pieces of evidence potentially containing direct information about the events of that night. In 1967, the tape was sent to the State Forensic Audio Analysis Lab, where technicians began the recovery process by cleaning the tape surface, removing soil, mold, and deposits that could damage it during playback. Because the tape had been severely affected by decades of prolonged humidity, recovery required gentle heating at low temperature in a controlled environment to stabilize the magnetic structure, followed by slow-speed playback on a specialized reader to minimize the risk of tearing. When the first audio signals were captured, technicians noted high noise levels interspersed with wind and regular impact sounds resembling waves or rocks. To filter the noise, they applied multiple layers of digital processing, including background noise reduction, frequency separation, and removal of abnormal amplitudes caused by physical degradation. After hours of fine-tuning, a fragmented conversation began to emerge more clearly. The audio captured two people speaking in tense tones, interspersed with long pauses and rapid breathing. A male voice was more audible, with a mid-low register, sharp articulation, and slightly compressed delivery as if restraining emotion. The female voice, though quieter and harder to discern due to noise, was identified as being under stress. When amplification was increased on low-amplitude sections, the analysis team detected a sequence of sounds resembling footsteps on rock, followed by a heavy impact consistent with the trauma mechanism recorded on the victim's bones. These signals suggested the recording may have been made at or near the rocky area of Narragansett, close to the time of the incident. To identify the voices on the tape, the Audio Forensics Lab conducted voice print analysis by extracting parameters such as dominant frequency range, laryngeal vibration, and speech patterns. Since the tape had no accompanying metadata, the team had to compare the captured voices with voice samples from individuals mentioned in the 1967 file that had been preserved in transcribed paper interviews. Because no official recordings of John or Evelyn existed from that time, comparison relied on limited supplementary audio material provided by the family, such as old family gathering recordings that had been digitized after 1980. Though limited in quality, these samples were sufficient to identify the timbre characteristics of John and Evelyn. When matched, the analysis team confirmed that the female voice on the tape shared features within acceptable variation with Evelyn's reference samples, though noise reduced confidence to moderate. However, the male voice on the tape was clearer. When subjected to voice comparison analysis, technicians input voice data from individuals appearing in the 1967 file, including preserved interview samples in police storage and audio from public events related to the recording industry in which John had participated. Notably, among the male voices compared, the voice sample of Victor DeLauro, obtained from a 1970s industry speech and a press interview, showed significant similarity in frequency structure and speech rhythm to the male voice on the Gotti. Reel-to-reel tape. When multi-layered comparison algorithms were run, the results indicated a high compatibility ratio exceeding standard evaluation thresholds, sufficient for the analysis team to conclude that the likelihood of the male voice on the tape belonging to DeLauro was very strong. In addition, acoustic analysis showed the male voice exhibiting controlling behavior with sudden amplitude spikes consistent with arguing or threatening context. Several wind and wave sounds on the tape, when matched against audio recorded at Hazard Rocks and Black Point, also showed similarity, reinforcing the hypothesis that the tape was recorded right at the location where the remains were found. After completing the analysis, the Audio Forensics Lab issued a report to South Kingstown Police stating that the tape content captured an argument between Evelyn and an unidentified man in a context likely involving conflict. With a high voice match probability, DeLauro became the most notable subject linked to the recording. The report emphasized the forensic value of the tape in demonstrating the direct presence of a male voice matching the suspect at a time and place consistent with the Marston's disappearance, adding another layer corroborating evidence to the reopened investigation after more than 3 decades. After the reel-to-reel tape was recovered and voice analysis showed a high match probability with Victor DeLauro, South Kingstown Police moved to re-examine all old physical evidence using modern technology to determine whether the fabric fragments, tire marks, and biological traces collected at the 1967 scene could be directly linked to the suspect. First, the light blue fabric sample recovered from a rock crevice at Hazard Rocks in 1967 was subjected to reflectance spectroscopy and infrared spectroscopy to identify fiber composition. Results showed the fabric was woven from a cotton rayon blend with a rare fiber ratio characteristic of the late 1960s, commonly used in lightweight men's jackets produced by a fashion brand for which DeLauro had purchase records preserved in his professional file. When the absorption spectrum of the scene fabric was compared to a reference sample from a jacket still held in the manufacturer's archive, the results matched closely enough to conclude that the fragment was very likely torn from clothing similar to the line owned by DeLauro. This reinforced the assumption that the man present at Hazard Rocks on the night of 1967 may have been wearing attire matching DeLauro's known possessions, creating the first physical connection between the suspect and the scene. Next, the team turned to the 1967 film photographs of the scene, which included images of faint tire marks on the dirt rock surface, combined with hand-drawn sketches describing tire width and tread. Thanks to modern image enhancement technology, technicians were able to recover some of the previously deemed unclear tread pattern details. When this data was entered into a historical tire pattern comparison system, the investigation team found that the distinctive tread matched a limited production sports sedan line manufactured between 1966 and 1967. A search of Rhode Island vehicle registration records showed that DeLauro had owned a sedan of this line at the exact time of the incident. Although old license plate records were no longer directly available in the system, surviving inspection and insurance records helped confirm tire structure and axle dimensions that nearly perfectly matched the tire impressions recorded in the scene photographs. When tire pressure and wear were simulated based on the average vehicle weight, the analysis results showed the ground impressions aligned with the radius and angle characteristics of the vehicle owned by DeLauro, placing the suspect's vehicle in high correspondence with 1967 evidence. Meanwhile, the biological forensics team continued examining the remaining preserved evidence from the original investigation, including the handkerchief and broken eyeglass frame. Although the likelihood of recovering DNA from these samples was very low due to long-term exposure and suboptimal storage conditions, technicians still applied surface-adhered DNA scanning on the materials. For the handkerchief embroidered with EM, results primarily showed DNA matching Evelyn's profile as expected. However, on the eyeglass frame, the remaining DNA was minimal but still yielded an analyzable foreign profile. When compared to DeLauro's DNA sample obtained from public medical databases under prior professional record regulations, the analysis team detected a high match level between the microscopic DNA on the frame and DeLauro's profile. The probability of error was assessed as very low, and the fact that the eyeglass frame was found in the Hazard Rocks area, a location not part of DeLauro's daily routine, increased the likelihood that this was trace DNA transfer during physical contact, possibly occurring when the victim or suspect handled the glasses during a struggle. When the three evidence data streams, fabric fibers, tire marks, and DNA were integrated into the same analysis system, South Kingstown police observed that the 1967 physical evidence, when re-evaluated under 2001 technology, consistently linked to Victor DeLauro. The fabric matched clothing types DeLauro owned. The tire marks aligned with the vehicle line he used at the exact time of the incident, and DNA analysis on the eyeglass frame indicated his biological presence at a location directly tied to the Marstons' disappearance. All these factors, combined with the audio analysis results from the reel-to-reel tape, formed a tight and continuous chain of evidence sufficient to establish DeLauro as the central suspect in the reopened investigation after more than 3 decades. Although a final conclusion on the case events could not yet be reached, the investigation team assessed that the newly analyzed evidence exceeded the threshold for ruling out random coincidence, placing DeLauro at the core of the file and opening the way for deeper investigative steps. After the evidence analyses and technical data strongly reinforced the likelihood of Victor DeLauro's involvement in the 1967 case, South Kingstown police moved to the step of collecting supplemental statements from old witnesses to determine whether contemporary social information supported the current forensic findings. The investigation team's first action was to review the original witness list in the file, cross-referencing it with 2001 residency data to identify who among them was still alive and capable of providing statements. The search revealed that some witnesses had passed away or moved out of state, but 3 remained alive. The female tavern employee who had seen the strange man approach Evelyn, the elderly couple who had observed the black sedan parked near Hazard Rocks, and a recording industry technician who had known John Marston. All 3 were contacted and agreed to cooperate with the authorities. The first witness re-interviewed was the former tavern employee, now retired but still recalling the incident quite clearly due to its unusual nature that evening. To test suspect identification, police prepared an archive photo array, including multiple images of individuals living in Narragansett in 1967, among them several old photographs of Victor DeLauro from his active years in music production. The array was constructed according to standard identification protocols to avoid unconscious suggestion, and the witness was asked to select anyone whose appearance matched her memory. After careful observation, she pointed to one of DeLauro's photographs, stating that the face and build were very similar to the man who had approached Evelyn outside the tavern. Although memory after more than 3 decades could not guarantee absolute accuracy, this identification aligned with the physical evidence analyses and became a critical link in establishing the suspect. The second witnesses were the elderly couple who had seen the black sedan near Hazard Rocks. Though age had dulled their recollections, they still described the vehicle as having a long, low body and distinctive tapered rear matching the sedan model owned by DeLauro at the time. When shown photographs of several popular 1967 car models, they selected the same type as DeLauro's sedan in registration records. This match was not sufficient as direct confirmation, but combined with the tire impressions captured in 1967 scene photographs and the technical comparison analysis, their statement helped reinforce the context of the suspect's presence in the area on the night of the incident. The third witness, the recording industry technician, provided information from a different angle. He had worked with John Marston on a music project and recalled that in the summer of 1967, John had mentioned a tense dispute related to a recording contract that Victor DeLauro was overseeing. According to his account, John suspected financial discrepancies in the production process and had stated that if not clearly explained, he would report the matter to company leadership. Though the technician did not know what happened afterward, he confirmed that DeLauro had displayed displeasure upon learning that John was questioning the expenses. This information led the investigation team to consider the possibility of a professional conflict motive, especially since it occurred during the same period as the Marstons' disappearance. However, because witness memory can be influenced over time, the team needed to verify the reliability of the statement by cross-checking with other documents. When reviewing 1960s recording industry files, police located several transaction records related to the project John and DeLauro had worked on together. Although no concrete evidence of financial misconduct was found, internal reports from the time showed that DeLauro had been warned about non-transparent cost management. Additionally, archived company office notes mentioned John requesting a review of a production contract involving DeLauro, which matched the witness's account. When combining the statement with archived documents, police ruled out the possibility of witness confusion or retrospective inference. To ensure consistency, investigators re-interviewed each witness using the same set of questions to test stability in their accounts. Results showed the witnesses maintained their original positions. The tavern employee identified the man approaching Evelyn as resembling DeLauro. The elderly couple confirmed the vehicle model matched DeLauro's black sedan from that year, and the recording technician provided unchanged information about a professional conflict motive across both interviews. There were no major contradictions or significant discrepancies between sessions. From this series of supplemental statements, South Kingstown police assessed that the witness data, even after more than 30 years, still showed reasonable consistency with the previously analyzed physical and digital evidence. The convergence of these information sources confirmed that focusing the investigation on DeLauro was reasonable and needed to be further expanded. Based on the results of the evidence analysis, supplemental witness statements, and digitized data obtained, South Kingstown police moved to the phase of evaluating the three foundational elements in a criminal investigation: motive, means, and opportunity, to determine whether Victor DeLauro met the conditions for committing the crime on the night the Marston couple disappeared in 1967. Regarding motive, the investigation team reviewed all information related to the professional relationship between John Marston and DeLauro, with the most prominent factor being the potential existence of a conflict stemming from financial issues in a music project. Archived company records from the record label showed that in the summer of 1967, John had signed an internal audit request concerning the production budget overseen by DeLauro. Although the audit report did not conclude clear wrongdoing, many details indicated expenditures exceeding projections and a lack of transparency in expense explanations, leading to DeLauro receiving an official warning. A witness from the recording industry who had worked with John confirmed that he intended to demand the company clarify DeLauro's role in unauthorized expenses and expressed concern that any dispute could damage his own reputation. When cross-referencing the timeline, the investigation team noted that the audit request occurred only a few weeks before John and Evelyn disappeared, creating the possibility that DeLauro felt threatened or faced the risk of deeper internal scrutiny. The motive of protecting his professional position, reputation, and avoiding legal liability was assessed as carrying significant weight in the competitive recording industry context of that era. Regarding means, historical vehicle ownership analysis showed that DeLauro owned a sports sedan consistent with the tire impressions captured in the scene photographs. The vehicle had a powerful enough engine to travel from Boston to Narragansett in a short time and was low enough to be parked discreetly in dimly lit coastal areas. The axle configuration and tread pattern matched the 1967 traces, reinforcing the likelihood that this vehicle was present at Hazard Rocks on the night of the incident. In addition, DeLauro had access to mechanical support tools, including a heavy object capable of inflicting injuries similar to those found on the victim's bones. When analyzing the terrain at Black Point, where the remains were discovered, the investigation team concluded that transporting bodies to the deep-tiered rock area and burying them in a rock crevice could only have been carried out by someone familiar with the terrain and possessing a motorized vehicle for close access. According to archive data, DeLauro had visited Rhode Island multiple times to work with recording artists in Newport and was familiar with the Narragansett rocky coastline, indicating he had basic knowledge of this complex terrain. Regarding opportunity, the timeline analysis based on digitized data allowed reconstruction of a plausible itinerary for DeLauro on the evening of August 17, 1967. Work records showed he left Boston that afternoon and had no specific work schedule that evening. The distance from Boston to Narragansett via Route 1A took just over an hour, fitting the time frame when witnesses saw the strange man approach Evelyn outside the tavern and aligning with the appearance of the black sedan near Hazard Rocks. Professional data also noted that DeLauro had a habit of traveling without a fixed schedule and had borrowed company vehicles for short business trips, increasing his flexibility to appear at unanticipated locations. When matching the timing in the reel-to-reel tape, including the argument sounds and footsteps on rock with tide data and on-site acoustic recordings, experts determined that the recording was almost certainly made around 8870 p.m., coinciding with the time witnesses heard loud impacts and crashes at Hazard Rocks. This allowed the assessment that the man present in the recording was at the scene during the most plausible window for the attack to occur. After synthesizing the three elements of motive, means, and opportunity, South Kingstown police constructed a suspect risk assessment model using the methodology applied in cold case investigations. Each element was scored based on its degree of match with physical evidence and witness statements. The results showed DeLauro scoring high across all three categories. For motive, he had sufficiently strong personal and professional reasons to prevent John from reporting him internally. 4 means he owned the sedan matching the scene tire marks and had the ability to access the rocky shore area. For opportunity, he had a compatible travel window, no alibi evidence, and was identified by witnesses as being near the victims shortly before their disappearance. The convergence of all three elements in a single suspect caused the investigation to focus almost entirely on one individual. Cross-referencing the entire sequence of events showed that random coincidence was highly unlikely, while the logical behavior and evidence distribution aligned with the hypothesis that DeLauro was present in Narragansett on that night in 1967 and could have been directly involved in the deaths of John and Evelyn Marston. From these analyses, the authorities concluded that the suspect met all three conditions for criminal commission and was the sole central target for subsequent investigative steps. After completing the analysis of motive, means, and opportunity, South Kingstown police proceeded to reconstruct the sequence of the crime by integrating three data groups: the victim's itinerary based on digitized time markers, the suspect's movement behavior based on collected facts, and witness statements from Narragansett on the evening of August 17, 1967. The reconstruction process began at the point when John and Evelyn left the tavern near Bonnet Shores around 7:40 p.m., continuing on foot along the path leading to Hazard Rocks. Witness data showed that at the same time, a strange man approached Evelyn with tense demeanor and, according to descriptions, an appearance matching DeLauro during his active period in Boston. When cross-referencing the victim's itinerary with the route the suspect could have taken from Boston to Narragansett, the estimated travel time fully aligned with the moment witnesses reported seeing this man appear at the tavern. Thus, the timeline model placed DeLauro in the Bonnet Shores area shortly before the victims, creating the conditions for him to approach them deliberately. The next step for the technical team was to determine the most likely attack location based on the distribution of evidence and traces at the scene. Evelyn's handkerchief and the broken eyeglass frame were found at the southern end of Hazard Rocks, while the torn fabric fragment was located in a crevice a few meters higher up. When simulating possible movement, according to the terrain, the investigation team identified the initial contact area as likely a flat rock ledge where the victims paused to watch the waves, consistent with the elderly couple's description of hearing noises around 8 p.m. Drag marks in the sand below and skid marks on the rocks leading toward the water indicated a struggle had occurred, during which one or both victims may have attempted to resist. Combined with the bone injuries, the model showed that John was most likely attacked first with a blunt object or slammed against the rock surface, causing skull fracture and rib breaks. This aligned with the absence of loud screams and witness statements. The victims may have been struck by surprise. For Evelyn, the posterior skull crack and chest trauma suggested she was attacked at a slightly lower position, possibly while attempting to flee or being pulled back. After determining the attack location, the reconstruction team shifted to evaluating the body transport route from Hazard Rocks to Black Point, where the two sets of remains were found. The topographic map showed the distance between the 2 points was not excessive if following natural rock tiers, a path a local familiar could use in low light conditions. Based on gravity modeling, slope, and evidence discovery positions, the investigation team determined the most logical movement direction was along the lower rock tier running parallel to the coastal road, where a sedan could be discreetly parked on firm ground. Nearby rock skid marks also aligned with the possibility that the bodies were dragged down from the attack site before being transported farther by vehicle. When re-examining the soil layer where the remains were found, sediment analysis showed the rock crevice used for burial had signs of manual shaping, indicating the bodies were placed and covered deliberately. This fit the sequence: approach, takfash; body transport, takferial. The reconstruction team entered all evidence collected from 1967 to 2001 into the model to test consistency. When running the spatial-temporal simulation, key elements aligned. Evidence drop positions followed the drag path. Injury directions corresponded to sharp rock terrain. Tire marks appeared at a vehicle-accessible location, and witness-reported noise times matched the suspect's presence at the scene. The reel-to-reel tape, when acoustically reconstructed, provided sound signatures closely matching the Hazard Rock spatial model, including wind and heavy impact sounds consistent with rock surfaces. Moreover, the male voice on the tape was identified as highly likely belonging to DeLauro, and the recording contained an argument with a female voice matching Evelyn's sample. This created a direct link between suspect and victims right at the attack area. Finally, when aligning the victims, suspects, and witnesses' timelines in the 3D reconstruction model, the events formed a logical sequence without requiring additional assumptions. Delaro approached Evelyn at the tavern, followed the Marstons to Hazard Rocks. A conflict occurred around 1801. Both victims were attacked, the bodies were dragged to a lower area, then transported to Black Point for burial. Each step in the reconstructed sequence was supported by evidence or witness data, making the likelihood of error or random coincidence very low. Thanks to the high consistency across scene data, statements, and the reconstruction model, the case sequence was established with sufficient reliability to support subsequent investigative steps. After the cream sequence reconstruction model showed a high degree of consistency between behavior, location, and timing related to Victor Delaro, South Kingstown police proceeded with the necessary legal procedures to obtain an arrest warrant for the suspect. The investigation team compiled all forensic results, audio analysis, evidence comparisons, witness statements, and digital reconstruction data into a warrant application exceeding 200 pages, presented according to 2,001 procedural standards. The file included independently verified evidence, the voice on the reel-to-reel tape compatibly with Delaro, microscopic data on the eyeglass frame matching his profile, sanitary marks consistent with the vehicle line he owned in 1967, and the tavern witness identification aligning with his appearance at the time of the incident. Additionally, the forensic report confirmed the victim's cause of death as intentional violent impact, with bodies concealed in a rock crevice at Black Point, consistent with analysis of the suspect's motive and means. All these elements formed a solid basis to request that the Rhode Island court issue an arrest warrant. After reviewing the file and hearing the presentation from the investigating agency representative, the district judge approved an emergency arrest warrant for Victor Delaro, authorizing his apprehension and a search of his residence in Providence, where he had been living in 2001 after leaving the recording industry years earlier. Immediately afterward, a joint task force of South Kingstown Police and Providence Police developed an operational plan, setting the arrest for early morning to minimize the risk of suspect resistance or evidence destruction. The participating force consisted of two teams, the arrest team approaching the front and back doors, and the search team prepared to enter once the suspect was secured. The plan was discussed confidentially to prevent leaks due to the sensitive nature of a cold case spanning more than 3 decades. At approximately 5:40 am, units assembled 2 blocks from the suspect's residence, awaiting the commander's signal. After confirming Delaro's presence inside, through direct observation and monitoring interior power usage, the arrest team approached the front door and knocked according to standard notification protocol. When Delaro opened the door unaware of the situation, the force immediately subdued him and read the arrest warrant, preventing him from accessing any items inside the house. After removing the suspect, the search team conducted a full sweep of his living space within the warrant scope, beginning with the home office deemed most likely to contain old documents related to the recording industry. In the office, investigators found multiple cardboard storage boxes containing Delaro's travel documents, personnel schedules from 1925-1997, and various dated recording industry items. Notably, in a desk drawer, was an old leather notebook in which Delaro recorded professional meetings and business trips. A note dated August 17, 1967, indicated L left Boston that afternoon to meet a partner in Rhode Island, but without specifying the partner's name or detail, consistent with the reconstructed travel timeline. During the storage room search, the team discovered an old cotton rayon jacket with decorative patterns matching the spectroscopic analysis of the fabric fragment recovered at Hazard Rocks. Though faded over time, the fiber structure and weave matched the delivery specifications from the fashion brand in Delaro's 1960s purchase records. The jacket had a slight tear on the sleeve, allowing comparison with the tear pattern on the same fragment. On-site examination showed the tear length and fiber direction were highly likely to match the fragment collected in 1967, continuing to the basement, where Delaro stored old belongings. The team found a metal box containing personnel items from his recording industry days. Inside were two Unus reel-to-reel tapes, budget notes for projects from 1966, 1967, and a memo indicating he had met John Marston in the summer of 1967 to discuss contract cost adjustments. This aligned with the recording industry witnesses' statement and added a direct motive link between the two men. In the same storage box, the search team recovered an old key for the sedan model Delaro had owned. When the key's stamp code was compared to surviving 1967 insurance records, technical staff confirmed it belonged to the vehicle whose tire specifications matched the same impressions. Though the car no longer existed, the key substantiated Delaro's ownership of a vehicle capable of being present at the scene. All said evidence was processed according to legal selling procedures and transferred to storage for further analysis. The arrest proceeded smoothly, without resistance, and enabled the authorities to collect substantial supporting data for the file. Upon completing the search, the team prepared a report documenting that the additional evidence recovered from Delaro's residence, including the matching jacket, scheduling notes, professional documents, and vehicle keyal, reinforced the connection between the suspect and the 1967 case, establishing him as the central figure in all subsequent legal proceedings. After completing the arrest procedures and collecting additional evidence from Victor Delaro's residence, South Kingstown Police transferred the entire case file to the Rhode Island Attorney's Office, paving the way for a trial scheduled to begin in early 2002. In the Federal District Court, a jury of 12 members was selected based on criteria, ensuring no conflicts of interest and no connection to the recording industry or organizations in Narragansett. On the very first day of trial, the prosecution presented the indictment. Delaro was charged with second-degree murder in the deaths of John and Evelyn Marston. Based on the chain of forensic evidence, physical evidence, witness testimony, and digitized reconstruction data, the prosecution's opening statement focused on modern forensic results that cracked a cold case that had lingered for 34 years. The prosecutor described the process of identifying the two sets of skeletal remains through DNA testing, explaining how STR techniques enabled analysis of heavily decomposed bone marrow samples and produced matches with John and Evelyn respectively. The prosecution emphasized that establishing the victims' identities was a critical foundation for reclassifying the case from missing persons to homicide. Next, the prosecution presented the forensic report on injuries, showing that John suffered a skull fracture from a heavy blunt force impact, while Evelyn sustained head and chest trauma consistent with forceful impact against a rock surface. Forensic experts testify that the nature of the wounds was inconsistent with accidental injury and bore characteristics of intentional violent conduct. Moving to the audio evidence, the prosecution called the audio technician who had performed the recovery and analysis of the reel-to-reel tape found buried with the remains. The expert witness described the process of noise filtering, audio reconstruction, and frequency analysis. He explained the voice comparison procedure between the male voice on the tape and Delaro's voice samples obtained from public events in the 1970s, stressing that the compatibility level exceeded the evaluation threshold for voice print analysis. When the audio segment was played in the courtroom, the jury clearly heard the tense argument between a female voice matching Evelyn's characteristics and a male voice bearing features consistent with Delaro. The prosecution stressed that this was not mere random coincidence. The tape's content, impact sounds, and recording time frame aligned with the 1967 scene data. Next, the prosecution presented the fiber evidence. A textile materials expert described the spectroscopic analysis performed on the fabric fragment recovered at Hazard Rocks in 1967, noting that the sample had a unique cotton rayon structure matching the jacket line owned by Delaro. The expert also displayed the jacket recovered from Delaro's home, visually comparing the weave pattern and tear direction with the scene fragment. This match was presented as clear proof that the suspect had been present in the Hazard Rocks area on the night of the incident. Following the fiber evidence, the prosecution moved to the tire mark evidence. They demonstrated the enhancement process applied to the 1967 scene photographs, enlarging the tread pattern and comparing it to historical data. An expert in vintage vehicles testified that the tire impressions matched a limited production sports sedan manufactured in 1966-1967, and that DeLauro owned exactly that model at the time. When cross-referencing axle width and tire type with old insurance records, the expert concluded the match probability was extremely high, reinforcing the likelihood that DeLauro's vehicle had been present at the rocky shore where evidence was recovered. Concluding the forensic portion, the prosecution presented the microscopic DNA evidence from the eyeglass frame recovered at Hazard Rocks. Although only trace DNA remained, the extracted profile contained segments matching DeLauro's DNA sample. The expert explained that the probability of random coincidence was virtually zero, especially since the glasses belonged to the victim and there was no plausible reason for DeLauro's DNA to appear on Evelyn's personal item, absent direct contact under unusual circumstances. Turning to witness testimony, the prosecution called the former tavern employee to the stand. She described in detail the face and demeanor of the man who approached Evelyn outside the tavern. When asked to identify, she pointed to DeLauro's photograph without hesitation. The prosecution emphasized that her testimony aligned with the digital timeline and physical evidence showing the suspect's presence near the victims just before their disappearance. The elderly couple was also called to testify about the black sedan they observed near Hazard Rocks. They confirmed the vehicle model matched the type DeLauro had driven. Although memory after many years was no longer perfectly sharp, the prosecution argued that the consistency between their statement and the tire mark analysis significantly ruled out misidentification. The final witness from the recording industry described the professional dispute between John and DeLauro, affirming that John had intended to report certain financial irregularities in a project DeLauro oversaw. The prosecution argued that this was the motive driving DeLauro to prevent John from reporting and potentially escalating to extreme behavior. When it was the defense's turn, DeLauro's attorney attempted to focus on investigative shortcomings in 1967, arguing that the scene had been disturbed over time and weather, rendering evidence analysis no longer absolutely precise. They contended that the fabric fragment and tire marks could have been carried to the area by sea, wind, or rainwater and did not necessarily belong to DeLauro. The defense also questioned the reliability of voice identification, asserting that voice comparison analysis could not provide a conclusive result in a tape of such heavy noise. They stressed that the tape being buried with the bodies did not prove DeLauro recorded it or was present at the time. At the same time, the defense argued that witness statements after more than 30 years could be faded and influenced by external information. However, during legal cross-examination, the prosecution countered that modern forensics had controlled for potential errors by using multiple independent data streams: DNA, physical evidence, audio, timeline, and geographic data. The prosecution pointed out that while individual pieces of evidence might not be sufficient alone, when combined, they formed a unified, coherent, and consistent system that random coincidence could not explain. The prosecution also noted that although the 1967 investigation had limitations, those shortcomings were overcome by digital analysis and modern forensics, enabling the case to be reconstructed with far greater accuracy than before. When closing arguments concluded, the judge instructed the jury to evaluate the persuasiveness of the entire body of evidence under the beyond a reasonable doubt standard. The jury reviewed forensic reports, listened to scene reconstruction experts, compared witness testimony, and weighed the defense's arguments about old investigative errors. After hours of deliberation, the jury concluded that the chain of physical evidence, digital data, and witness statements formed a consistent system. While the defense's objections were not strong enough to break that coherence, their verdict was that the evidence was sufficient to establish legal responsibility on the part of the defendant. After the jury concluded that the chain of forensic evidence, digital data, and witness testimony was sufficient to prove Victor DeLauro's responsibility for the deaths of John and Evelyn Marston, the trial moved to the sentencing phase. The presiding judge reviewed the entire case file, including the indictment, the jury's verdict, and aggravating factors proposed by the prosecution for sentencing consideration. Before delivering the sentence, the judge summarized the gravity of the case: 2 victims missing for 34 years, only discovered when Hurricane Nora exposed the burial site. Bone injuries indicating intentional violent assault, and the act of concealing the bodies at Black Point, clearly demonstrating intent to cover up the crime. The judge emphasized that the passage of time did not diminish the danger or the exceptionally serious nature of the offense, as concealing the bodies for decades prevented discovery, left the family without answers and denied the justice system the opportunity to reach the truth for an extended period. Based on the jury's verdict, the court formally declared Victor Delero guilty of murder in the second degree for each victim, resulting in 2 counts of second-degree murder. Moving to sentencing, the judge considered the prosecution's recommendation of 40 years per count, citing the intentional nature of the attack, the personal motive tied to a professional dispute, and the attempt to eliminate a perceived threat to Delaro's position in the recording industry as significant aggravating factors. The prosecution also highlighted that Delaro's burial of the bodies in a rock crevice using the complex terrain of Black Point to avoid detection demonstrated a high degree of calculation and premeditation, warranting treatment as an independent aggravating factor. The defense requested leniency based on the passage of time, the defendant's age, and his past professional contributions, but the judge ruled that the passage of time could not erase criminal responsibility and that the defendant's age did not reduce the severity of the proven conduct. After weighing all circumstances, the judge formally sentenced 40 years imprisonment for the murder in the second-degree count involving John Marston and 40 years imprisonment for the murder in the second-degree count involving Evelyn Marston, to be served consecutively for a total of 80 years. The court stipulated that the defendant would not be eligible for parole or sentence reduction during the first 25 years of incarceration, to ensure an appropriate level of deterrence and to reflect the gravity of the intentional taking of 2 lives and the prolonged concealment of the crime. In explaining the sentence, the judge noted several aggravating factors. First, the violent assault resulting in the deaths of both victims. Second, the personal motive tied to preventing a professional threat Delero perceived through an internal dispute. Third, the deliberate concealment of the bodies to erase traces and delay discovery of the truth for over 3 decades. Fourth, the defendant's lack of cooperation throughout the investigation process, as well as the absence of any clear mitigating circumstances related to external influences. Upon completion of the sentencing statement, the court ordered the defendant immediately remanded to the custody of corrections authorities for transfer to a state correctional facility, concluding a trial process that had lasted many months. The jury was discharged after fulfilling its function, and the judge noted that although the case spanned many years and was affected by technical limitations at the time of the offense, modern investigative methods and evidence recovery had enabled the law to deliver a firm final judgment based on objective data. The sentence closed the criminal proceedings of a case that once seemed unsolvable, marking the moment justice was finally established within the framework of Rhode Island state law. After the court issued its sentence and the formal proceedings concluded, South Kingstown Police, together with the State Forensic Agency, conducted a comprehensive case review to evaluate the entire investigative process from 1967 to 2001, identifying the factors that prevented resolution at the outset and drawing professional lessons for handling future cold case files. The summary report pointed out that in 1967, investigators were heavily constrained by rudimentary forensic techniques and procedures. DNA testing did not exist. Scene trace analysis was limited to visual observation. Audio recording technology was not standardized, and the absence of a national data repository made evidence comparison nearly impossible. Additionally, the complex terrain at Hazard Rocks and Black Point narrowed search efforts, while the bodies buried deep in a rock crevice were completely beyond detection capabilities at the time. These factors, combined with the passage of time, caused scene erosion, evidence obscuration, and witness statements that lacked supporting data reinforcement, leading the case into deadlock and forcing closure as a cold case. When re-evaluating each step of the 1967 investigation, the report concluded that the failure was not due to lack of effort, but to lack of technology. If DNA testing, digital acoustic analysis, and spatial temporal reconstruction had existed then, most evidence could have been exploited far more effectively. The inability to locate the victims' bodies in the early stage prevented establishment of a homicide charge, profoundly impacting investigative direction. This was regarded as the core reason the case remained unsolved at the time. In contrast, forensic advancements in 2001 played the decisive role in reopening and solving the case. Thanks to modern DNA technology, experts could analyze heavily decomposed bone marrow and produce accurate identification results. Digital noise filtering and voice analysis on the reel-to-reel tape enabled pinpointing the suspect's presence during the argument with the victims. Digitization and enhancement of 1967 scene photographs allowed re-identification of tire marks previously deemed insufficient for legal value. Textile material spectroscopy enabled analysis of the hazard rock's fabric fragment and comparison with clothing owned by the suspect. 3D reconstruction tools based on terrain and environmental data accurately simulated the body transport path from the attack site to the burial location. Together, these technologies transformed the fragmented 1967 data into a seamless chain of evidence capable of meeting the beyond a reasonable doubt standard at the 2002 trial. In the summary report, South Kingstown Police emphasized the critical lesson of long-term evidence preservation. Had the fabric fragment, eyeglass frame, investigative files, and scene photographs not been carefully stored for over 3 decades, the 2001 forensic recovery and comparison would have been nearly impossible. The case demonstrated the value of a controlled condition evidence storage system with periodic inventory, as every piece of evidence, no matter how small, could become a crucial puzzle piece when technology advanced. This led investigators to recognize that future forensic knowledge could turn seemingly useless items into case-breaking keys. In addition, the report affirmed the importance of detailed record-keeping. 1967 scene diagrams, witness descriptions, wide-angle and close-up photographs, and investigator notes became foundational data when building the digital reconstruction model. Those seemingly simple documents were among the factors that connected data across the 34-year gap between investigative phases. The review results also proposed a refined model for modern cold case handling. Reevaluate original files digitally. Digitize all evidence and statements. Apply new forensic technologies. Expand data through voice analysis, scene reconstruction, geographic crime analysis, and trace DNA, combined with motive means opportunity assessment using a risk-scoring model. This model was recommended for adoption not only in Rhode Island but nationwide. The Marston-DeLauro case quickly became a flagship case study in training new investigators, as it clearly demonstrated the importance of persistence, systematic data collection, and the decisive role of modern forensics in solving cases once thought unsolvable. In training programs at the Rhode Island State Police Academy and Federal Investigator Development courses, the case is used as a practical example to help trainees understand multi-layered case reconstruction, combining old evidence with new technology. The summary report stressed that while time may obscure traces, scientific progress always has the power to bring truth back to light if evidence is properly preserved. Thanks to the coherence of the entire process, the case not only closed a crime committed more than 3 decades earlier, but also laid the foundation for a standardized approach to cold case handling, becoming a classic illustration of 21st century forensics' ability to uphold justice. In the Marston case we have just followed, many details reflect issues that still exist in American society today. The limitations of the legal system when facing incomplete technology, career pressures leading to unethical behavior, and especially the risks of non-transparent information in highly competitive environments. Victor DeLauro committed the crime partly out of fear that financial misconduct in the 1967 recording project would be exposed to motive, rooted in lack of accountability and refusal to accept transparency. This lesson is entirely relevant to modern America, where industries from technology and finance to entertainment all demand transparency and rigorous internal oversight. Another detail is that the 1967 file failed largely due to the absence of modern forensic tools. Yet small pieces of evidence like the fabric fragment, eyeglass frame, and scene photographs were preserved long enough for 2001 forensics to reanalyze them. This reminds us that in modern life, the persistent retention of data, whether work-related, financial, or personal, can become decisive when proving truth or protecting rights is necessary. The reel-to-reel tape, seemingly useless, became pivotal evidence 30 years later. That reflects the value of the traces we leave in today's digital life. Emails, messages, transaction histories, all can become evidence or tools for self-protection. And finally, the case shows that the combination of modern technology and investigative persistence can deliver justice even when it is long overdue. In today's American society, where many feel powerless in the face of legal failures or unresolved cases, this story reminds us that truth can be buried, but it does not disappear, and that justice requires time, data, and perseverance. Thank you for following along on this journey to solve this cold case. If you'd like to continue exploring stories of justice reclaimed after decades, please hit subscribe to join us. See you in the next video, where we continue opening doors to the past to uncover buried truth.